For half a century, the world's largest nation has been communist. Chairman Mao Zedong created the People's Republic in 1949, and since then, tensions between China and the West have remained volatile. But despite the strain between the West and Red China, there once was a time when some in America saw Mao Zedong as a natural ally. When World War II broke out, nationalist Chinese forces under Chiang Kai-shek received the goodwill and financial support of the Allies. But a secret mission of American operatives formed a partnership with the Communist Army of Mao Zedong. One of the great ironies of the war is that the United States unwittingly played a role in China's conversion to communism. For 20 years, two men dueled for the future of China. Mao Zedong led a battle-hardened band of guerrillas fighting to create a communist China. China's nationalist army was led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, whose name in the Mandarin dialect is pronounced Zhong Kai-she. By 1936, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists in China had been raging for nearly 10 years.
Mao and Chiang Kai-shek clearly had a visceral hatred for each other. It was often forgotten, and Mao never publicly discussed it very much, but his second wife, I believe it was killed by Chiang's troops in 1927. Chiang also saw the communists as the single greatest threat to his vision of a united China under his rule. And I think over time, Mao and Chiang did see each other as symbols of what the other hated most and resented most.
But in 1936, China's decade-long civil war was being upstaged by a new threat: Japan. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 might well be considered the first act of the Second World War. 8 years before war broke out in Europe. Manchurian armies fled into China. China's border provinces soon became targets of Japanese expansion. Weakened by civil war, China was ripe for invasion by Japan. Many Chinese felt there was only one hope: a united front. If the battling armies of Mao's communists and Chiang's nationalists could fight as one, they might repel the invasion. The only difficulty was that Chiang Kai-shek believed the internal threat to China from Mao was a greater problem than the outside threat from Japan.
I suppose the best way to characterize how Chiang and Mao saw each other was an aphorism that Chiang once said. He said, "The Japanese and other foreigners are a disease of the skin. The communists are a disease of the heart." They were the ones that really threatened, as he put it, China, meaning him and his rule of China.
Thus the stage was set for one of the most bizarre acts of spycraft and subterfuge in the storied history of World War II. A hostage crisis that would unite the bitter enemies dueling over China's future. As the Japanese threatened to move into northern China in 1936, Chiang preferred to focus his armies on his final extermination campaign against the communists. He ordered the army of General Zhang Zhuliang, known as the Young Marshal, to surround Mao's stronghold in the city of Yan'an and lead an assault. Instead, the Young Marshal quietly contacted the Communist Party headquarters in the ancient city of Xi'an. Xi'an, in the center of China, was the capital for the ancient Chinese dynasties 2 centuries before Christ. The first emperor of China built his palace and his tomb there. it was a fitting place for the creation of a new China. Marshal Jiang was a Manchurian. He wanted revenge on the Japanese invader, and it was clear he was not going to get it from Chiang. He had to force Chiang's hand. Unaware of the secret meetings between the Marshal and the Communists, Chiang Kai-shek impatiently headed to Xi'an to personally lead the young Marshal's troops against Mao. Upon arrival in Xi'an, the hunter became the hunted. The young Marshal placed Chiang under house arrest and sent word to Mao. His enemy was now detained. Hurried conferences of communist leaders debated whether to jail Chiang, exile him, or execute him. But Mao Zedong agreed with the young Marshal. The real threat to China was not the long civil war, but the invading Japanese. Changing 10 years of communist policy, Mao then offered to join hands with his mortal enemy. The offer to Chiang Kai-shek was simple: renounce his attempts to destroy the communists and agree to combine forces as allies against their joint enemy, Japan. In truth, Chiang had little choice in the matter. Chiang Kai-shek returned to his capital in Nanking, proclaiming the deal a triumph rather than a humiliating defeat. The war for the future of China was put on hold for the time being. The new alliance came none too soon. Within 6 months, Japan was poised to invade China itself. The Japanese turned their sights on Shanghai. Then, as now, it was the financial heart of China. A coastal city built by Westerners. An international metropolis once called the Paris of Asia. It was Shanghai that the Japanese attacked in 1937.
The Great Battle of Shanghai was fought between August 13th, 1937, and it ended November 25th. It was a horrible battle. In that period of really only about 3 months, the Nationalists lost about 300,000 men. They lost eventually because the Japanese were able to outflank them and make a landing at Hangzhou Bay to the south and come around and cut them off.
From Shanghai, the invaders rapidly made their way to the capital. Japanese troops began a rampage of atrocities that has come to be known as the Rape of Nanking. In a 3-month period, the Japanese army killed over 200,000 civilians, raped an estimated 20,000 women, and then burned the city. In the north, Japanese troops invaded the provinces of Jehol and Shanxi. Here they met a combined Chinese force of nationalist and communist troops. In Pingqingguan, nationalist troops pretended to flee before the invaders, leading them into a high mountain pass and a trap. Communist guerrillas, trained in mountain fighting, descended upon the Japanese, wiping them out. The Battle of Pingqingguan was an enormous victory for China's new united front. But it would be their last. Japan rapidly conquered the coastal cities and manufacturing centers. Chinese troops, primarily trained in techniques of civil war, were poorly armed and poorly fed. They were no match for the disciplined, well-equipped armies of the rising sun. By the end of 1937, Japan considered China a conquered nation. But in the rural West, Chiang Kai-shek still proclaimed himself Generalissimo of Free China. And in the mountainous Northwest, Mao Zedong's communist stronghold remained unconquered. Now it was time for a different kind of war. A war of guerrillas. A war of spies. Japan invaded China in the summer of 1937, and by year's end had occupied the major cities of China's east coast. Shanghai, Peking, and Canton all had fallen. But one corner of Shanghai had actually remained untouched. Here in this most western of Asian cities, the United States and European countries had settlements with the status of colonies, settlements that the Japanese dared not touch. From 1937 to 1941, this European section of the city called itself Island Shanghai, a neutral sanctuary in a sea of Japanese occupation. Island Shanghai soon became a home for spies.
Shanghai was a perfect place for a city of intrigue to be located in because it really was 4 different cities. The city was divided into an international settlement, which was essentially run by the British, a French concession, a Japanese section, and then the Chinese portion of the city. Someone could commit a crime or carry out an assassination raid in one part of the city, step across the boundary into the international settlement, and instantly find asylum there. It was almost as though you were living on the border of 4 different countries.
The Peace Hotel, still standing today, became Spy Central in the late 1930s. In its grand ballroom, the communist underground watched Japanese operatives while nationalist secret police tailed British spies who were snooping on German agents. In the bars of Western hotels and in the back alleys of Chinese slums, deals were struck, assassinations were planned, and treachery was unmasked.
You know, one of the hardest things to piece out, if you look at this period carefully, is who was working for whom. People changed sides. That was recognized. I've interviewed people in China who had worked for one side or the other. It made Vienna or Berlin look like child's play.
Far to the northwest of Shanghai were the headquarters for the spies of the communists. Yan'an was quite a contrast from the debauched pleasures of Shanghai. Mao and his followers lived in caves dug out of sandstone mountains. His soldiers were mostly peasants. They followed a Spartan egalitarian regimen, a peasant lifestyle for a peasant regime. Traditional military strategy was futile against the much better equipped and more powerful Japanese army. So Mao Zedong turned to guerrilla warfare, with surprising results.
Mao was an avid reader of the Chinese classics, many of whom featured these Robin Hood figures from the Ming Dynasty, or going way back, that employed these tactics. You lure the enemy to penetrate into your base and then you spring on him.
Mao's Bible for guerrilla warfare was a 2,500-year-old book, Sun Tzu's classic, The Art of War. This ancient guide to military tactics is still used today by corporate strategists and military leaders. Sun Tzu said, "The best military force has no constant formation, as water has no constant shape. The ability to gain victory by changing and adapting according to the opponent is called genius." In his own textbook of guerrilla warfare, written after reading Sun Tzu, Mao remarked, "The army lives among the peasants like the fish in the sea." Echoing the art of war, Mao said, "Fluidity of battle lines leads to fluidity in the size of our base areas. Our base areas are constantly expanding and contracting. As often as one base falls, another arises. Fluidity of territory is entirely the result of the fluidity of the war." Mao's guerrillas attacked Japanese railroad tracks, disrupted troop movements, blew up arms caches and ammunition dumps, then disappeared into the surrounding villages. When Chinese peasants were conscripted by force into the Japanese occupation army, Mao's guerrillas did a brisk business buying their Japanese-supplied guns and ammunition. To the peasants of the northern provinces, Mao's guerrillas were truly the Robin Hoods of China. But Mao Zedong had additional support in his campaign of secret warfare. This was an espionage training camp created and funded by the Soviet Union. Based in Mao's headquarters in Yan'an, it was called the Institute of Oriental Munich.
The Institute of Oriental Munich was controlled by the Soviets. It trained hundreds of agents for Asian Communist parties, and that include how to use secret ink, how to penetrate into enemy's tent, for example, and how to use codes. And those special skills were needed for any agents.
A time came when Mao's spies could return the favor. Mao soon had trained spies in various places throughout China and even in Europe. In May 1941, one of Mao's agents met a German military attaché at an embassy party. The German proudly bragged to his new Chinese friend that Hitler was about to turn the tables on Stalin and invade Russia. The Chinese agent excused himself and immediately radioed headquarters. Shocked by the news and pleased by his far-reaching spy network, Mao contacted Stalin.
Stalin wouldn't believe it. Stalin thought this is Oriental garbage and some kind of conspiratorial scheme. And of course, when Barbarossa started in June 22nd, 1941, Stalin realized he had been mistaken.